you out this person out. I know you don't like it because they broke into your bar, or maybe they attempted to murder somebody. The more resources you give this person, the more important I can do it again. Because at the end of the day, we're not necessarily incarcerated criminals.
late and beloved colleague, Professor Joan Peter-Cilia, who passed away just a couple of months ago. Joan came to Stanford from UC Irvine more than a decade ago, and she really transformed the study of criminal justice here at the law school because she was the world's foremost expert on sentencing and corrections, and she was also a great leader in encouraging our students to engage in policy research about the criminal justice system. And as some of you may know, probably the most important project she undertook while here at Stanford with all of us, particularly with the students, was about the enactment of Realignment in 2011 and this massive question of the transfer of incarceration authority and power and resources, to some extent, of course, from the state to the counties. And under Joan's leadership, our students performed a number of really interesting research tasks, including given how realignment would allocate money to the counties with a lot of discretion within the counties. The real question is, how are they doing it? What patterns did we see, and so on? We produced some great reports on that score. So this event today, timely, of course, we see as kind of a next step in our own exploration of what incarceration has become in California. And I just want to thank you all for coming and again just say a word about our great colleague on that behalf. I'll turn it over to Debbie.
Thank you. So great to have everybody here. Thank you so much. For those of you who need to use a restroom, we have a women's restroom on this floor. The men's restroom is down below. I just want to make sure that we do some little bit of housekeeping. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to have Ryan Gabrielson's going to give us a little bit of an overview about some of the work that ProPublica has been doing with the Sacramento Bee, what they've been finding. They've been doing a series, and he can tell us how long it's been running. Really fabulous up until yesterday. They have a new story out about suicide watch isolation in the jails that's becoming an issue in the wake of realignment. And then after Ryan talks and provides a little bit of context, I'm going to moderate a discussion with this fabulous panel that we have here, and then we're going to make sure we open it up so that you all have an opportunity to ask some questions as well. So Ryan, with that.
What do I use to control the slideshow?
You can do that, yep, I think. Yep.
Okay. Hi, as she said, I'm Ryan Gabrielson. I'm a reporter at ProPublica. I've been working all year with this fine gentleman, Jason Pohl of the Sacramento Bee and McClatchy newspapers as part of a project at ProPublica called under the Local Reporting Network, which funds exactly what it says, investigative reporting at the local level. And this project is focused on the conditions in California's county jails in the years since realignment took effect. And so I'm going to start off by going with a broad overview of what realignment is and then just sort of touch on our main findings. So what is realignment? Realignment, in 2011, the U.S. Supreme Court held up a lower federal court ruling that California's prisons were unconstitutionally overcrowded, rendering medical and mental health care completely ineffective, and ordered a massive reduction in that population, one way or the other, however the state wanted to do it. Governor Jerry Brown and state lawmakers enacted several reform measures, most importantly AB 109, Assembly Bill 109, that basically designated that all individuals newly convicted of non-violent, non-serious, non-sexual felony offenses would serve their prison sentences in county jails rather than state prisons. It did a number of other things, but that is, in terms of the county jails, probably the most significant. Maybe Sheriff will, during the conversation, will chime in with additional thoughts on that. But as from what we've seen, that is probably the most significant change in terms of jail operations and who arrives and is serving time there. As you can see from this chart, that is the overall incarceration population numbers for the state of California. The first one between 2009 and 2010 is where it was when the federal court, a 3-judge panel, ordered that the prisons had to be brought down to 137.5% of their rated capacity, which tells you that they said you can be only a 37% completely overcrowded. They were at one point 180%. It was just really incredible. Every open space in the state prisons was occupied by a bed, it seemed, at some point. So in the wake of realignment, the prison population started declining. The county jail population which had been at the time mid-70s, jumped up about 10,000 until late in 2014, November 2014, Proposition 47, which reduced a number of offenses, property and drug offenses, to, correct me if I'm wrong, to either, certainly not prison sentences, not terms of incarceration, to misdemeanors. And that dramatically reduced the influx of people to county jails. As you can see, that a very sharp drop. And we get down to where today, on the whole, county jail populations statewide are significantly lower than they were even before realignment. So the other major things that realignment brought is higher healthcare costs because they're holding people serving longer sentences. The triple nons, non-violent, non-serious, non-sexual, they could serve multiple years in a county jail. They were often an older population. They tended to be more complicated and more expensive. To offset that, the state dedicated billions of dollars to cover the cost of regular operations for sheriffs, probation, DA and public defenders, and local police departments. It also committed a little over $2 billion to upgrade and build new jail facilities. So, in beginning our reporting, there's not a ton of comprehensive data on conditions inside California's county jails that we can look at across the board. One of the more reliable is death data that is collected by the California Department of Justice. It is sort of one of the most unambiguous measures. Somebody is dead or they're not, and we can count them, and by law, the counties are supposed to report their in-custody deaths to the state. One of the most significant things that stood out to us post-realignment is inmate-on-inmate homicides. Not everywhere, but concentrated, particularly in the Central Valley County jails, a marked uptick, and statewide a 46% increase. We requested autopsy reports from dozens and dozens of counties and found some consistent patterns, especially in places where the homicides had increased. People in county jails were attacked, really without anything to impede them. These were a lot of times, sometimes they were spontaneous violence, but sometimes they were clearly planned assassinations. And many times guards not only didn't notice when the altercation or the attack was happening, they sometimes didn't discover for several hours. In one case, well, I'll get to that. Sheriffs in many county jails operate with minimal staff and use overtime very heavily to cover basic shifts. So looking at the homicides, one way to look, Los Angeles County underwent a series of scandals about 8 years ago in the county jails and were subject to federal criminal investigations, including the sheriff who was convicted. They are under several new layers of oversight, and the effect has been fairly significant in terms of deaths, and particularly in terms of inmate-on-inmate homicides. LA County used to be one of the primary places where these occurred. Post-realignment, not because of realignment, but post-realignment, that shifted. And so while LA County dramatically improved, all other counties, the other 55 counties that have correctional facilities that they run, saw a pretty significant increase. And I believe that when you take out LA County, it wasn't a 46% increase in homicides, it was a 150% increase. Speaking of which. So Merced County's main jail, it's a 50-year-old facility that is a linear design. You can see basically how the narrow hallways, anyone who's seen an old prison movie, Shawshank Redemption, same design. You have to be standing directly in front of the cell to see what's going on inside it. It's decrepit, very difficult to effectively monitor what's going on across multiple cells at once. Modern jails are podular, which means one person in a control tower can actually see into 3-4 different spaces at once, in addition to looking on cameras. Merced County has been complaining for years and years and years that its main jail is decrepit and dangerous, and they put it in several reports. Realignment, at least a major component of it, was ostensibly to fix those problems, and this is why lawmakers put $2.1 billion into a fund just to replace these jails and expand other types of operations. In 2013, Merced County put in to replace main jail. They failed to include several key parts of the application and were rejected. Conditions deteriorated in 2015. The death data goes back to 2005. There were 0 homicides until 2015 inside. And then the 3-year period from 2015 to 2018, there were 3, and they all have pretty clearly are gang assassinations, all inside main jail, which is the smaller of the county's facilities. At this point, the county is no longer even applying to replace main jail. They have been approved for state money to expand a different facility, but that means main jail, with its current population, will continue to be open in perpetuity. So who's in charge of this, the money, and making sure that it gets spent on the things that are needed? The Board of State and Community Corrections is California's agency, the only agency that oversees jails. It was created as part of Realignment. It took a piece of prison bureaucracy, refashioned it, and made it its own agency. They are in charge of overseeing and revising state jail standards and also disseminating huge sums of money. They oversee all of the construction projects and structurally handle all the applications, but they have no power to ensure that the requested money actually goes to the projects that the county needs, or that the construction begins on time or ever begins. 11 different projects have been returned, including San Francisco, which is a different story than most places, but I imagine you guys will talk about that. Mostly it's smaller and more rural counties that have received funds to fix outdated facilities and return those monies. It's a breakdown. Basically, the construction pillar of this project has not gotten off the ground in the way that was expected in 2011. Only 11 projects completed, the same number of them have been forfeited. Meanwhile, there are currently 10 other projects, and 33 many of them perpetually for years in various planning stages. Okay, California has jail standards. Now let me define what standards are, and I'm probably running out of time, so I'll try to pick it up. Jail standards are not regulations. They are not enforceable. They are guidelines. They are voluntary. They largely focus, not exclusively, but largely focus on whether policies covering certain areas are in place and whether structural features of a jail meet the standard they apply to, or the year that applies to them. There are very few limits written into concerning actual day-to-day operations. The standard writing process has, for up to this point, largely been staffed by people from representing law enforcement agencies. So every 2 years they go back and look at what ways to improve, to tighten the standards, and the people making most of those judgment calls come from law enforcement agencies. Regardless, they are, like I said, voluntary, and the state agency that does inspections to check for compliance with those standards has no authority to enforce them. They also have no authority to investigate deaths or any other life-threatening circumstances, which is different from other states which have agencies that do go in when it's believed that there might be a problem that leads to death or threaten life and safety. Okay, so this leads to the most recent story. In Kern County jails, they have been using Suicide Watch quite aggressively. In 2011, independent of Realignment, they started having a spate of suicide deaths. The sheriff's office responded by using isolation cells. All basically exclusively when somebody was identified by the deputies. Intake is done, or the initial screening assessment is done by sheriff's deputies. If someone is deemed to be a risk to themselves, they are put on suicide watch, which in Kern County means a suicide watch cell most of the time, which is a bed, a small cell with a bed and a toilet sink fixture that's not supposed to have any sort of hanging fixtures, and they're stripped naked, given suicide smocks, and most importantly, perhaps, they were given yoga mats to sleep on. Starting in 2012. They wouldn't give them mattresses. They said everybody else in the jail gets mattresses. They wouldn't give them mattresses for concern that the suicidal inmates might barricade themselves in with them. And so, yeah. Last year, a BSCC inspector went in and cited the jails for 27 violations, 14 of those directly tied to yoga mats. The sheriff's office responded 8 months later and said, "We think you're wrong. We're doing things in compliance with the standards." And that same month that they responded, they bought 60 more yoga mats. I think they bought 100 more ultimately this year. And until they continued to use them, and actually we got to see them in use during our first tour. After we followed up with additional questions, but the next time we went down, they told us they had stopped using the yoga mats. They didn't respond to the state inspector, but they did respond to us asking questions. Kern County holds suicide watch inmates in 24-hour isolation for days, weeks, and months, including safety cells. Actually, I skipped right over. That's a safety cell. So when Kern County runs out of suicide watch cells, they start putting people in suicide watch overflow, which is a safety cell, which is a room with 4 walls and a grate in the floor for bodily fluids. They are not fit for people to spend more than a few hours. They're when people have completely lost control and they're trying to...
Closet.
It's a closet, man. It's terrible. It's pretty clear that that's not supposed to be a room that somebody stays in. The Kern County Sheriff's Office was putting people in, is putting people in for several days and sometimes more than a week. So you see the document over there. When we found out about from the state inspection reports about the suicide watch practices, we put in a records request for the observation logs. Under the standards, they're supposed to document every 15 minutes what is going on with the person in either a suicide watch cell or in a safety cell. Their particular form, they document on the top left. The first page is just the first page, the face sheet with the person's name in the beginning of the log. Then you see the continuation page. Every single one of those pages represents about 3.5 hours in real time. That's page 506, which means more than 2.5 months inside suicide watch 24-hour a day isolation. They don't get recreation time if they're on suicide watch in Kern County, because their argument is if they're healthy enough or stable enough to get fresh air outside, they're ready to go off suicide watch. Oh, they also don't receive mental health care while on suicide watch. They get assessed and evaluated and not treatment. That's us. Stay tuned, we got more. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah. So grateful to both of you for the work you're doing to really sort of uncover some of these issues. So I'm going to really briefly introduce our panelists because I know most of you have formal bios. But who we've got tonight is Ryan Gabrielson, who's a reporter for ProPublica, who's been covering the U.S. justice system. His colleague Jason Pohl is an investigative reporter with the Sacramento Bee. Jose Valle is a community organizer with Silicon Valley Debug, which is an advocacy and multimedia storytelling organization based out of San Jose. Jose helps families with incarcerated loved ones navigate the justice system and encouraging them to do more than just depend on their attorneys by helping them understand the court process and penal codes. And finally, we have Sheriff Vicki Hennessy, who's the sheriff of San Francisco and the city's first female sheriff. And I believe you've risen up through the ranks since 1975, so
That's
you've
right.
devoted your life to working in the correction system. Under Sheriff Hennessy's leadership, the Sheriff Department has expanded the breadth and depth of training classes and programs within the Sheriff's Department. So I think, Sheriff Hennessy, I'd like to start with you and just sort of ask you an overall question about kind of what has realignment meant for San Francisco County? And recognizing that San Francisco is a little different than many other counties. We have, for those of you who don't know, we have 57 counties in California. So what has, 58, why did I say 58, 57, 58. I even have a county map up in my office, 58 counties. So what has realignment meant for you, for your deputies, like day to day? What does it mean? What's different?
Well, I think you have to go back a little bit and say that San Francisco is a city and a county, and is a charter city and county, so it's a little bit different than other counties where the sheriff has a lot of other additional responsibilities in terms of law enforcement for unincorporated areas. So one of our main functions in San Francisco as the sheriff is to run the county jails and to maintain them. So I was fortunate enough to start my career under reformed-minded sheriffs. So I've been through a lot, and I think San Francisco, I think the rest of the counties are in a way catching up to San Francisco because we were overcrowded back in the 80s and 90s. And we had a consent decree for 14 years. And our sheriff at the time, named Michael Hennessy, who was no relation to me, but I used to work for him, was part of that. I mean, he was in favor of that lawsuit because really it got us the facilities we needed, it got us the resources we needed for a time. So let's fast forward now to AB 109. AB 109 did not affect us as much because San Francisco had a history of not sending that many people to state prison anyway. So as you know, AB 109, you went back to the county jail from which you originated. And so we did not have an overcrowding problem. I think we're one of 2 or 3 in the state that had that issue. However, Prop 47 certainly has affected us, and we've always had, in San Francisco, we've always been leaders in pretrial release, and that's another thing. So, you know, I was watching this presentation that you just gave, and it's very interesting because the jail I'm trying to replace is just like the Merced County jail it's a linear jail. It looks just like that. The bars are corroded, everything is terrible, but we are still running that jail in the best way we can. So the type of prisoners that we have now, it's just more of a concentration of people with serious and violent crimes because the people who are not in for serious and violent crimes very often are released on pretrial release through the courts. Mm-hmm. And so my average daily population is about 1,300 people in jail, and our population out on pretrial release is about 1,300 people, so it's about 50%. Very few misdemeanors in our custody. We have about 8% maybe at the most, and most of the people that are in our jails with pretrial also have additional holds. They have probation holds, they have state parole holds. So those are the people coming back, state parole holds, people out on probation that come back to us, and motions to revoke is the other one that the district attorney often, instead of charging a new crime, will charge a motion to revoke on probation because that person already has been on probation. So in our jails, that's who we have. And we are seeing people stay longer. There are some people that are AB 109, 1170H prisoners, as they're called, basically, that are compelled to do county time, and some of that county time has to be done in the jail. Now, as the sheriff, you have a lot more say on who gets out of jail if they're actually sentenced to county jail time. And so I have very little say because I think I have 39 people that are sentenced that are out on alternatives, and I have I have about 40 that are out on alternatives. So I have 39 that are in stages waiting to go out, and some I have to keep for a certain amount of time per 1170H rules. Right. So that's how it's affected us. So what we end up having more of in San Francisco is people with serious mental illnesses, and I think that's across the board perhaps. People who are poorly housed, or they're not housed appropriately, so they're in and they're not coming to jail because they're poorly housed, but they report being homeless or not having stable housing, and people with co-occurring substance use disorders. So we have a lot of that in our jails. So what we end up seeing, and it's also a strategy in San Francisco as well, is we have a lot of people that are committed to state prison, but they've been in jail so long because their cases are continued for so long that they end up getting what's called a paper commitment, which means that they get credit for time served instead of state prison. And that's somewhat of a strategy that the public defenders and the defense attorneys are using. And we recently got a MacArthur grant, a safety and justice challenge grant, to check on the continuances in court and why people are staying so long. I've got, I think, one person in my jail has been there 10 years, one person. But, and the majority of people get out in 3 days, by the way. But so it's kind of interesting how that works. And then we have, and also they're looking at people who come back to jail repeatedly during a year. So that's a study that's being done right now, and we're working on that.
Let me ask you one quick follow-up question, and then I want to ask Jose something. Sure. So you mentioned that you now have individuals who are staying longer in your facilities and that have more serious mental health challenges.
That's correct.
What does that mean in terms of how has that shifted how you think about what programs need to be delivered, what your responsibility is to provide services to the population that you're now incarcerating?
So I think we're really lucky in San Francisco. We have the Department of Public Health is our main, and their standards, and they try to strive to keep the standards of community standards of health, mental health, physical health, whatever. So they work very hard, and we work very closely with them. So we have recently created what we call step-down pods and sheltered living pods, and we've had sheltered living pods for a long time, but now what we're doing is we're training our officers to work more closely, and the same officers to work in those units, not in a uniform per se, but in a different kind of, like a black shirt and khaki pants. And they're working day to day with the mental health providers, behavioral health providers, in making sure that the inmates are doing what they're supposed to do, the people incarcerated in those areas and are doing what they're supposed to do. Things like hygiene, making sure that their hygiene is good, making sure that they're getting out of their cells, that they're doing things, and we started groups and things of that nature. So, and if you earn your way into different housing, depending upon what the jail behavioral health says, they basically make those rules. So we're working very closely with them on that. Okay. And that's about 145 people.
And then one additional question. So Ryan brought up both that homicides have gone up since realignment in many jails. Yeah. The use of suicide watch isolation has gone up. That a lot of counties have been applying for money but then not actually getting facilities built. How do those sort of issues relate to San Francisco? Are any of them relevant to you?
Oh yeah, I'll try to remember all of those. First of all, we have not had a homicide. I've been around for 40 years. We have not had a homicide that I can recollect. We may have had one. I'm trying to remember back in the day, but no. And suicide, since I've been sheriff, we haven't had any. And one of the reasons is because one of the things I began when I got there, because I used to work in the jail and I used to know how this went, is we had to make sure that we were checking on people all the time, and that people were not just signing round sheets without doing rounds, and they were doing rounds according to the way they were supposed to do them. The other thing is, in San Francisco in our jails, our people are in with the people in jail. They're in there mingling with them. They're not up above it in a capsule, and so there's a lot of contact. And one of the things I'm was also working on is reintroducing direct supervision. We'd gotten away from it a little bit because we introduced it back in the 80s and 90s when we had more people and we had more misdemeanors that were staying for longer. But it's a little more difficult to do with pretrial people, but we reintroduced that.
What do you mean by, I'm sorry, some of us might not know, what do you mean by direct supervision?
So there's seven concepts of direct supervision. It's basically about the same deputies working with the same group of people every day, and in the morning having a pod meeting, a housing unit meeting, hearing grievances, talking about what's going on, okay, what are we going to do for the day, that kind of thing. We're not there yet because we have people coming and going so much, and as mentioned, our staffing is not what it should be. And so that's the other thing, when we have people working overtime all the time, it's like having a substitute teacher in the pod instead of somebody who knows the people. So we've reintroduced that as well, and that's direct supervision. So in terms of, and you had a last question.
The construction.
Oh, the construction. So I was
Construction
elected
hours.
sheriff in 2015, but I didn't start my term until January of 2016. And in 2015, in December, a jail that had been planned for 10 years and which had been received an approval and a grant from the Board of State and Community Corrections for $80 million was turned down because of the concern of over-incarceration and the concern that, so the jail that it was going to replace, there had been 2 jails closed already that were 1,000 beds. This was going to be a 384 bed facility that included treatment beds, included program areas, included a lot of things that our linear jail did not have and does not have, and that's the 7th floor of the old Hall of Justice on Bryant Street in San Francisco, which is a sick building to begin with, and so that got turned down. So after that, we worked on what we called the work. I joined a work group with community advocates, anti-jail advocates, and others called the work group to re-envision the jail and to look for mental health solutions that did not involve jail, to look for other ways of getting people out of jail. And what ended up with that is that we did get some things accomplished that needed to be accomplished. We were able to increase the efficiency of our pretrial release and get people out, get more people out. And then because of the Humphrey decision, which we haven't talked about, but that basically a appellate court decision that said that you had to offer bail to anybody in amount they could afford. Well, instead of doing that, the judges started putting more people out on pretrial release, and it increased electronic monitoring, which we do. And so that was an interesting thing. So we got 200 to 300 more people out of jail more quickly, safely. And I think safely is the answer we want here for the community, for public safety and everything. But our count didn't go down at all in the last 4 years. And so just recently, last week, we had a meeting again about the need for a replacement facility. And it, and everybody still is trying to get more people out of jail in a thoughtful way. And I think that's okay, and I'm all for that. But I also think that when you have a jail that you're trying to operate and you're in charge of, that is totally, it's substandard in every single way. I think that's not fair to the people that are in that jail. Mm-hmm. So there's this balance, and I haven't figured out how that's going to happen.
Right.
Okay.
Jose, so you work with Silicon Valley Debug, which is a very active community-based provider and reform, almost like agitator in the community,
Right. Yeah.
keeping things, providing some community oversight, I think, on different parts of the criminal justice system. What has realignment meant for the role of Silicon Valley Debug?
Right, at Debug, we do a number of different things. So we're not necessarily service providers.
Right.
For individuals in reentry and realignment, where what we have is something called participatory defense, and what that is basically, usually it's family members, usually someone's mom or their wife. They have their incarcerated loved one. It's pre-trial, and they're facing some time, and they kind of want to, they're already putting money on their books. They're already going to all the court cases. They're already they're already accepting the GTL phone calls, jail calls, but they want to do more. And they're frustrated with their attorney. They don't know how the system works or what's going on, but they want to do something more. So usually what happens is they come to Debug, and we basically empower them to act as an arm to their attorney, make sure that their attorney does hear them. Because what happens is a lot of the times, you have a public defender that's overworked, which makes it really hard to focus and put your energy into one case. Or you have a private attorney that might do the same line of work, not necessarily better or worse, but you have to pay that person. What we do is empower the families to make their attorneys work for them, right? And understanding the court case, the court process, and also understanding the exposure, the minimum, and what could actually impact, what'll end up being the result of the case. So we also do something called social vow package, where we basically, for the most part, a judge or the DA, or if there's a trial, the jury is only going to see one individual for, what they're there for. So we have a social vow package, which attorneys call a mitigation package, that basically lift that individual's character of who they are, kind of like a positive rap sheet, right?
Yeah.
And so that's something that we also do. But I think in doing that work, we see all the holes in the system, right? And so one case in particular, in Santa Clara County, we're currently under a consent decree. There was an individual, I think he was waiting on a bed. His name is Michael Tyree. He had some mental health issues, and he was already supposed to be out, waiting on a bed, waiting on a bed at someplace somewhere. And unfortunately, before that day could happen, he was beaten to death by 3 correctional officers. So I think the fact that he had some mental health issues. I think the fact that prison reform is sexy right now, so people are actually listening, they care, right? I think the fact that he was already waiting on a bed, he had pretty much done his time waiting on a bed, was homeless, had some mental health issues, and he was beaten in this fashion and killed in this fashion, raised a lot of hell. What happened as a result of that is that there was a prisoner-led sort of movement inside the county jails where others seen the same injustices. Some of them have already gotten beaten by officers as well. Some of them were pre-trial. In our county, we have about 70% or so pre-trial. So you have some individuals there pre-trial for about 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years fighting their cases, and they're in the hole. When I say the hole, I mean they're maximum security. They're only let out an hour or so out of the day, if they're lucky, right? And some often inhumane conditions. And so there was some individuals that they got together. They thought, this is a perfect time to actually bring up this issue. And so they organized and they went on a hunger strike, filled out, wrote a letter to the sheriff, made it public, Silicon Valley Debug, because we were helping out some of the family members that their loved ones were participating in the hunger strike. We were supporting this effort, and we brought it to light. And as a result, there's basically the consent decree came about. They reached out to the prison law office in Berkeley, went on 3 annual hunger strikes to really make a fuss out of this. And now for sure, individuals are spending less time in maximum security. They have access to actually down class. They can't just have you in maximum security just because they think you're somebody or they think you're going to do something. It's more of a behavioral based model. There's still a lot of holes. There's still a lot of issues. And what we found, I think, with the realignment thing is that, on top of that just happened during this period of time, just coincidentally with realignment, there's also more individuals that would have more than likely did their time in prison, are doing their time in the local jail, but spending longer periods of time in a local jail. So now you have individuals that they're asking for more, and not because they're spoiled or they want luxuries, but they're asking for more basic human rights behind the walls that are believe it or not, sometimes a little better condition-wise in our state prisons. We hear this all the time. These guys, they're telling us, I can't wait to go to prison. And I don't think that's what realignment was about. You know, and they're not saying that because they can't wait to be a better criminal in prison, or they can't, like, prison is actually a better place, but just the treatment and the culture. You know, you got, you know, people in prison that are doing their life sentences, you know, so they want to be treated like men, or in a woman's facility, they want to be treated like women, not as subhuman. So, you know, there's a little bit more of an understanding in the culture. Not everything is good in prison, but on a county level, I think that the sheriff administration and stuff like that, they're not used to treating individuals in a humane fashion. And so this is what's probably new. And we had suicides. We done had a few suicides during this period of time. We have a questionable suicide that happened with Isai Lopez last year. I questioned the suicide itself. I believe, because I seen the pictures, you know what I mean? There's no way this man could have hung himself with a head dented in, and 2 reports of getting beat by cops within the same time period that he supposedly took his own life. There's something going on in our county. So for sure, I think it's, as a community, it's about accountability. For them, I think we want them to come back home sooner, and we want them to come back sooner, become better men, right? And I think as far as the sheriff administration, you know, like Santa Clara County, or in Santa Clara County, or similar counties, they better get used to it. You know what I mean? They need to treat these individuals like human beings, bottom line. You know, and I think that there's more of a benefit for them than there is for, say, like, I'm formerly incarcerated, for us, right? And I say that because the more you treat me as a human being, and the more you give me resources while I'm inside, so that I could change whatever behavior, because it wasn't me that was error, it was maybe my behavior. Or maybe it was a product of inequality and poverty in my community that led to that behavior. You feel me? But all that could be fixed. But if you know, you're hard on crime, you put me in the hole, you know, I might come out a better criminal, and I'm might break into your house or do something crazy because I can't get a job. Right. You know what I'm saying? I didn't have access to certain resources. So the more you get, it's a win-win. The more you give me resources, I'm gonna do good. You know, I'm gonna take care of my families and worry about number one.
Can I say one thing about what he said about state prison? The county jails are not built to be state prisons, and I think that's what you're saying, because the architecture is not there. And as you were talking about the fact that people who have been in state prison are staying longer and longer, they want outside time. In San Francisco, none of our jails have outside recreation, but that's something. When you're in a state facility, you get to walk around, you get to go outside, you can go from building to building, you might get classes. We do in San Francisco give college classes, high school classes, lots of programming to pretrial as well as sentenced individuals. So we do that for everybody. But it does make it more of a challenge for us because of the design of the facilities. Because the design of the facilities may be, maybe rooms that take 2 people, each room. But then there's only 1 day room, and then when you have people that don't get along, you can't let them out, because one of your primary rules in any jail is to keep everybody safe. But you don't want to keep them locked up all the time just to keep them safe, and that's not right either. So the design of the jail is very, very essential in my mind. And even our best jail, which is our San Bruno facility, which was built in 2006, which is a direct supervision, does not have the discrete areas that I would like it to have, so that we could have more interaction, more people out. And it's just a matter of how much money people want to spend on building a facility and maintaining it. So that's it.
So Jason, I would like to bring you into the conversation. Jose kind of talked about the role that both, I think, prisoner advocacy and community pressure put on the jail to really sort of change some conditions and to provide some oversight. Is that correct,
Right.
Jose?
Yeah.
Ryan, I would or Jason, I would ask you, like, in doing the stories that you have done together, it seems like a common thread is that there is, on a statewide basis, no oversight over what our county jails are now doing in terms of, so if you have a sheriff, like Sheriff Hennessy, who has a very strong commitment to sort of doing the right thing and providing rehabilitative opportunities and using jail space appropriately, right, then you're okay. But then if you've got a sheriff like the one maybe in Kern County who's thinking a little differently, what's to keep him on the right path?
Yeah, so what you're getting at is something that we've been running into all year when we've been looking at how to go about this project. Because when you talk about county jails in California, it seems like a pretty simple thing. We're talking about a part of the criminal justice system across a state, right? Except it's not that simple. We have 56 counties that have jails in the state of California. And what that means is we have 56 different ways of running a jail. And some of those overlap, many of those do not. And one of the areas where that can become problematic is where you have sheriffs or jail administrators that decide to take a more, shall we say, punitive approach toward dealing with their population, as opposed to a more treatment-based approach to dealing with population. And while there's a system in place that Ryan mentioned called the Board of State and Community Corrections that oversees various aspects of the jails and writes these minimum standards and conducts these inspections and is in some ways in charge of the purse strings for grants and other funding opportunities, when it comes down to it, the enforcement side of things is non-existent with them. And in fact, in our most recent story that came out yesterday, we had spoken with the individual at the BSCC who is in charge of that inspection process. And she told us point blank, we are not enforcement. And they admit that they're not the ones who can bring a hammer down on a jail. And they're not the ones who will be out there enforcing these minimum standards. And so what we're left with is, as Ryan mentioned, these very different ways of running facilities. And in Kern County, for example, right, we have a very extreme use of isolation and some very punishing conditions for that suicide watch isolation, and a state jail oversight entity that is powerless to change it. And so as we continue with this reporting, as we continue trying to talk to various different sheriffs that are doing things one way or various different ways, we're trying to figure out what other threads can tie all this together, and ultimately what changes, if any, are necessary to improve conditions statewide.
Yeah, I was struck in the article yesterday by the report that comes out from BSCC to the county says something like, if the department elects to correct the non-compliant issues, please send us a report telling us that you've done so. So no, it really leaves it to the local county to decide whether or not, but does not require them, put any sort of mandate upon them to actually address the issues that have come up in the inspection. That's
right. It almost reads more like an invitation than a mandate. And that's coming from the Oversight Board, which we thought was pretty surprising. And perhaps, I don't know if the sheriff has encountered any of those sorts of maybe philosophical disagreements with the minimum standards, but it can just boil down to that. And that's a really surprising thing for us.
Yeah, I guess I would ask you, Sheriff Hennessy, and try to bring in some of your colleagues, your sheriff colleagues, would you welcome, and would they welcome having a state authority that actually had a little more teeth to it? So that there was some statewide oversight over basic conditions, that we were collecting information on, it surprised me that BSCC does not keep track of how many homicides are taking place in every jail. That seems like sort of a basic piece of information that they would need to know in terms of how things are moving. And even in the flow of money, right? That like we're gonna give out $2.1 billion worth of funding, but not really require that the money be spent. There's no penalties if you've delayed in how you use the money or things like that. So I'm just wondering, like, you know, certainly we could ask the state legislature, why didn't you do it? Why didn't you create BSCC that had more authority or more teeth? But I would be curious to know from you, like, whether or not you feel like your colleagues, or was part of accepting realignment and you know, taking on the responsibility of so many more individuals, was this blank check that you get from the state and being told that you're not going to be sort of.
Well, we do have a
No.
commission that we had to put together with the probation, and probation actually is the lead in the money that comes from AB 109 in San Francisco. I think it is in most counties.
CCP,
Yeah,
yeah.
statewide. And it's not just us, it's probation got the bulk of the money because it was based on community corrections more than it was on in-custody corrections. I would say, I'm not going to speak for other sheriffs.
Okay.
But,
That's
but
fair.
I would say what you're proposing sounds a little bit like a hospital, you know, what the hospital has. They have the state hospital board that comes in and does very serious inspections and cites you and sits on you until you take care of what the issue is. I've never had any issues with the State Board of Community Corrections because I feel like if they're going to take the time to do the inspections, that we're going to comply with it unless it's something that we just can't comply with for some reason. And I want to use their reports in order to get resources. It doesn't always work, but you know, maybe something like that would be a better way in terms of deciding who gets resources. But in my experience, as my limited experience as a politician, I've only been sheriff for 4 years. First time I ran for anything, and I didn't run again.
Mm-hmm.
So here I am. In my limited experience with politician, I'm finding out that if you do a good job, you don't get funds. But if you don't, then the money gets thrown at you. I mean, that's kind of a little bit of you know, the way it works. So would I, as the sheriff, if I stayed as a sheriff, I would probably welcome it. I would rather have a state organization do it, you know, in a way that's thoughtful and that holds us to accountable standards.
Yeah.
And then gives us the opportunity to correct those standards if we need to.
You should know that we did invite several state legislators to join us this evening, so we could ask this question of them. You know, why doesn't the BSCC have the authority to really sort of monitor what's going on in the local jails? We also asked someone from BSCC to join us, and they couldn't either. So we were hoping to be able to bring their perspective into the conversation, but certainly seems like from the reporting that Ryan and Gabriel have done that I feel like you've identified that agency needs a little more teeth. Anyway, I want to open it up so that you all have a chance to ask questions. I've been told that our microphone does not work. Surprising.
It's the sound isn't recorded or something.
Okay, so we're going to ask people to just speak, stand up and speak loudly. And maybe also just want to ask that you ask a question. Statements are lovely, but in order so that we can really bring a lot of people into the conversation, let's keep them as short as possible and make sure that it is a question. Great. You in the gray shirt, sorry. Yeah. Yeah, that's you.
Oh, it's like it's blue, but it's fine.
Oh, I'm sorry, doesn't it look right?
Just a question about like who like is in charge of running state jails. It sounds like a lot of counties are elected sheriffs. Is there an election mechanism on the state level, or is that an appointed position?
Sheriffs or jails are controlled by and large by county sheriffs, all except for 2 or 3 counties in the state of California. But by and large, it's the elected sheriff across the state.
And so state prisons, are they run by elected officials?
In state prisons are a totally separate thing,
Yeah.
run at the state level by appointees.
Okay.
Yes.
So for Josh and Ryan, in trying to get information about money and stats and things like that. Has the Public Records Act worked for you, or do sheriffs find ways to withhold information?
Both. I will answer that in a couple of ways. First and foremost, in a lot of the different records that we've used for this project, we've been able to get them because they haven't solely relied on going through sheriff's offices to get them. So for example, details about litigation, like people suing the sheriff, right? That's court records, that's county records, Board of Supervisor records, all of that. So that's been incredibly helpful. When it comes to getting records about individual cases or jail operations or some of those more, say, closely guarded type documents that you might imagine, we have hit some pretty thick walls on that, and that's something that's been sometimes incredibly frustrating, because at the end of the day, what we're hoping with our reporting is to just illuminate a little bit more about what's happening inside these jails, and basically pull back the veil, because ultimately these are taxpayer-funded facilities run by taxpayer-funded positions where sometimes awful things happen. And that's a long-winded answer to your question, but it's been helpful in some ways and a hurdle in others.
I noticed that there was nothing said about oversight by county, at the county level, the boards of supervisors. And coming from Alameda, I've been astonished to hear our supervisors say things like, we have no control over what the sheriff does inside the jail, outside of budgetary oversight. And so I'm curious about what you have found in that regard.
Well, I was just going to say, in San Francisco, it's a little bit different because of the charter, and the Board of Supervisors can call us to account for ourselves at any time they want to, and it says that in the charter. But there is a move to establish oversight in a way over the elected sheriff. The idea of having an elected sheriff is supposed to be that you can remove the sheriff easily, by a vote of the public. In San Francisco, city and county, 49 square miles is a little bit different than Alameda County or Contra Costa County or other counties in the state that are so huge and have many different jurisdictions.
So is it county by county, according to what the charter says? Is that?
Yeah, well, I'm saying my Board of Supervisors in my charter
Yeah.
can ask me to report, they can call me to a hearing at any time they want and talk about it. However, they are still investigating, looking at that oversight.
And,
So.
and I'll just add that there are a couple other things in other counties across the state regarding oversight. Every county has a civil grand jury
Yes.
that is supposed to inspect jail facilities, and they author a report. Some of those grand juries take that task very seriously and write pages and pages about what's happening inside when they tour. They do audits about financial records. They'll look at deaths in custody. Other civil grand juries basically copy and paste, quite literally, the previous year's report and make a couple of different findings, and that's the extent of it.
Yeah. You mentioned grand juries. I met with our grand jury on Monday, and they are really excited to take the tour. And I think this grand jury, each grand jury is different people. You never know who you're going to get on a grand jury. And I've been through a lot of grand juries, and this grand jury looks to me like they're really interested and they're going to do, I don't know what they're going to key in on or what they're going to do, because that's up to them, but they are going to visit the jails next week and a couple times throughout the year. So I think that's good. The other thing I'm going to say in San Francisco that we have a Controller's Services Audit Committee that at the request of the Board of Supervisors can come in and audit anything they want to audit, and we're certainly going to allow them to do that. So.
Jose, do you know whether or not in Santa Clara the Board of Supervisors has played any kind of oversight role over the jail?
Yeah, I would say to sort of answer your question, I think any county with an elected sheriff, the Board of Supervisors do have a lot they can do. For example, in Santa Clara County, there was an issue at some point where the sheriff administration didn't want to budge. And in Santa Clara County, we have a specific population, the Southerners, a very small group. So they historically have been in protective custody. What they were fighting for was that, they didn't believe they were protective custody, because with protective custody, what that entails is that, which I never knew until I met these individuals, over the phone, but they tell me that, once, if and when they get sent to a prison because they have protective custody on their jacket, they may be confused with someone who is a child molester, a sex offender, an informant of some type. So once they hit prison, they could either risk lose their lives, risk their lives, or get more time based on whatever altercation that may happen. And I had no idea. And so what they were fighting for is to be maybe not necessarily in general population, but in something other that wasn't protective custody. And these guys were going on 14 days. And I think it was Halloween, October 31st, a couple years back. And, some of these guys were passing out. Their moms were calling us. Their wives were calling us. They're not eating, on hunger strike. And, finally we had a conversation and call with Cindy Chavez, which is one of the board of supervisors of our county. We grilled in on her office, we finally got a conversation with her. She had a call to the sheriff. The sheriff got a call, finally met the terms, and they were able to end their hunger strike on that day. They were able to get out of protective custody. They're no longer considered protective custody. They're not a general population, but they definitely do not have to risk their lives anymore or risk getting more time if and when they hit a state penitentiary based on their convictions. So, that alone, Cindy Chavez saved a lot of lives, and we're able to get this specific population back home sooner to their families. So, and there was a similar situation in Alameda County. One of our guys, they got shipped to Glen Dyer, and they also led a hunger strike there. And one of the demands was, better food. They were giving them the proper nutrients. They were giving them like a ball of, I don't know what.
Soy.
Yeah, and so the county board of supervisors in Alameda County, we were thinking maybe they'd have nothing to do with it because it's federal. Glen Dyer is federal. But no, they have a lot to do with it. So they were able to give these guys like a whole different line of meals. You know what I'm saying? That was definitely different from that big hard ball they were used to. So you'd be surprised.
I just want to add one quick thing on that too. This was came up a little bit at the tail end of the most recent legislative session in the form of an assembly bill by Kevin McCarty in Sacramento, and this was called the Sheriff's Oversight Bill. Forgive me, I don't remember the exact bill number, I'd hate to get it wrong, but essentially what that would do, or would have done, is given these civilian panels convened by Board of Supervisors subpoena power to have some authority to get documents from jails, sheriff's offices, things like that. And the quick backstory on that was in Sacramento County, there's a bit of an adversarial relationship between the sheriff and some other folks, and there was an inspector who came in, not a BSCC inspector, a county inspector, who came in to try to do some work and authored a report that was going to be very critical of the sheriff's, a couple of the sheriff's operations and a couple of key details. And the sheriff literally locked the doors and prevented that inspector from doing their job.
Oh, wow.
Like changed the locks on the doors. And so that was sort of the backstory behind how Kevin McCarty got involved in this bill that would allow somewhat greater civilian oversight and subpoena power for jails.
But the bill didn't go.
Correct.
I just have a question for the sheriff. I remember one of the first events that Trump went through when he became president was to invite sheriffs to the White House. And in that conference, he said, we have the highest crime rate that we've had in 47 years. Because nobody believed me when I said that. But of course, it wasn't true. But not one sheriff in the meeting corrected him. And I always wondered, did they not know that this was completely not true? Did they not care?
Fake news.
I didn't go. I wasn't there.
But what's your sense about what sheriffs know about big things like that?
I don't know. I mean, you know, you're talking about nationally now, and sheriffs are not always elected. Sheriffs come from different walks of life. Sheriffs serve a lot of rural counties and things like that that are sent to these places. And I think in California, I think the sheriff should know, and I think that statistics are more and more important as we go forward. And that's one of my challenges that I've had a very difficult time with, was getting the money and the work, because it's not just with the sheriff's statistics, it has to be connected to the law enforcement statistics and the criminal justice statistics, the public defender statistics. And we have something in San Francisco called Justice, Justis. It's been around since 1998 and was part of a charter amendment for San Francisco to make sure that we were all working together, and it just kind of fell apart about 10 years ago. And so now we're trying to redo it. And meanwhile, what we're finding is the data that we collect now that we planned for back 15 years ago in our new computer systems that are changing so quickly every day, that is not the data we're looking for today to collect, and so it's very difficult. So I've got initiatives in the Sheriff's Department to redo our whole jail management system, start asking the questions that people are asking me about the people that are in jail, things that were not anticipated 30 years ago, 20 years ago when we did these systems before. So I think that in order for me to find these things out, to even do a presentation before the board, I have to do a lot of have my staff do a lot of manual collection of statistics so that we can tell you how many people are in jail, what they're in jail for, how long their length of stay is, what the ethnic breakdown is. We are able to get some of this easily, but then to really dig down inside it is a lot more difficult. So, yeah.
Sure. You mentioned the 850 Wyatt jail, or excuse me, not Wyatt, Bryant jail in the city. So there's currently a really strong kind of movement against that jail, not only to close it.
I'm sorry, could you speak up a little?
Yeah, sorry. Sorry, I wasn't fit.
Yeah, that's okay.
You mentioned the 850 Bryant jail in SF. There's currently, and I want to bring this in really briefly, a really strong abolitionist movement actually against that jail and against the further construction of other jails.
Yes.
And of course, they're tied into networks like the amazing campaigns happening in Denver, in New York, in St. Louis, in Sacramento, in LA, et cetera.
Right.
Which has been inspiring to me, and I think driving the conversation about reform and about kind of imagining new worlds without caging people. So, Jose, I was wondering if you could maybe, as an organizer, speak to kind of the power of that kind of abolitionist way of thinking about, like, how do we mobilize people around futures without cages altogether?
Right. How do we mobilize people?
Yeah, like what is the role of that type of thinking in these
Right. I think right now is probably the best time to have, as far as best case evidence, as to why, putting people in cages are not necessarily the best for themselves and their families or the community as a whole. Right now we have a very, a great opportunity, and I don't know how long, opportunities come and go, and this is a great time period to actually prove that, maybe we shouldn't keep people in prison for the rest of their lives. Maybe we shouldn't leave them in the hole in these closets that you've seen. There's a different way. I think that there's also a different challenge that's probably not being addressed, is that a lot of these individuals, they coming out now after 5 years, 10 years, 15, 30, and they're coming back home sooner, but they can't even afford to rent.
Yeah.
You feel me? And a lot of the families, they don't even live there no more because they couldn't afford to rent. They got to go to Modesto and Stockton. So that's probably where I'm interested in knowing, where is this all going next? Because these are often places that don't have resources, very conservative, and these people that already fought for rights for generations here in places like San Jose, Oakland, San Francisco, and Stockton, and Modesto, they got to start from square one. I think that you know, for sure. I mean, this stuff is nothing new. You got what in the '60s they did a Stanford project on, you know, how incarceration doesn't work. They made a movie about it on Netflix not too long ago, and I mean, it's not the way. I think that anytime one person has completely 100% control over another individual in their life, in their space, that's the issue. And I think that's where abolition comes from. You know, and I think that we come from this old stinking thinking that, you know, you did something wrong, you got to pay for it. And the only thing we know is do time. You know what I'm saying? And have the most worst experience possible in somehow, some way, because you have the most worst experience possible, you're going to have an epiphany and change. And that might happen for some people, but the numbers obviously don't add up to that. But right now, keeping people out of cages and having them come home sooner, the numbers do add up. That is working, you know.
Did you, Dorsey?
I have a question, because I know people go to jail and get out. And I'm interested in knowing, you know, what role does the BSCC have on the resource dollars put in the community for offsetting the question of housing, offsetting the question of support, and all the rest of it? Because obviously, if you're in the county jail, you're not getting any training whatsoever. And when they come home, if housing is not available, and the BSCC, as explained by y'all, don't have any teeth to actually do anything with the sheriff's department, no matter what they do, what teeth do they have overseeing the probation department that's governing the rest of the money that is going to? How do we enforce adequate treatment of people who are being released from jail and having access to resources once they get out? Because they're going to have to go somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Jason, you
I'll-
talk about that?
I'll talk after you.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, it's a very good question. It's a very good question.
It's a tough one.
It's a tough one too, yeah.
Because without pulling up the BSCC website and going through their entire list of all the grants that they're in charge of, the short answer is yes, there is money that the BSCC does allocate for counties for various different reintroduction and, I guess, bridge type programming. I will admit that I don't honestly know all of the details about what they have in place for that, because much of the project that we're focused on has been conditions inside jails and less about what happens when people get released. But what I will say is there are grants from various different funding sources that do go to counties for these types of things. And when it comes to like the probation type services that you mentioned, I think, if you look for whatever county you're in, there's a community corrections partnership group that's established, CCP, and on it is the chief of probation, represented from the sheriff's office, and then several people from throughout the county. And in those CCPs, these annual reports, annual plans, that's how they decide how they're going to divvy up the money that comes from the state related to realignment. I don't know much beyond that, and perhaps the sheriff.
They're supposed to do a report each year
Each
and
year.
tell you how they're spending that money. But I would say, you know, this is the hardest. I've been doing this for 40 years. This is the worst I've seen it in terms of people being able to get out and have a place to go. And if you think about it, it's kind of interesting because the people in our jails who have mental health problems, who have substance use disorders, who need programming, when they get out, they're competing against the general public now for those same programs, that same housing. And so the question is, who do you give that to first? Do you wait till the people who are mentally ill over here get bad enough that they may end up in jail now they have to go to jail in order to get services, so when they get out they'll get a place to go? Or do you try to get them, or do you do both? I mean, and that's what I think we try to do. But one of the things we've been trying to do in San Francisco is I created a discharge planning office for people getting out. It's there at night when people get out generally, because we don't know when people are getting out because they're pretrial, and a lot of people get out without being sentenced, or they go to court one day and the judge says, okay, set credit for time served, and you get out. So we've created we've created a voucher system for getting people safe rides. We've created a hotel voucher system for people to get them a night in a hotel if they have no place to go. And we use our own money and the general fund money from the city to also support housing for people that is supervised housing. It's like a sober, safe living environment housing for people. We have beds at Salvation Army that we have for people. So it's all piecemeal though. It's not as coordinated as I would like it to be. But that's not what you're asking. You're asking about the money from probation and how that's used, because probation also does a lot of what I do in that regard.
I just got this small follow-up question, because like, there's a whole bunch of us out here that provide real services to people.
Yes.
That's in jail. I've been at this for 48 years.
Right.
So it ain't like I just jumped into this.
Right.
I'm just not new at the rodeo. So my question is how do we actually funnel money from the state to some entity that's not law enforcement, so we can actually exercise some real authority to provide real services without tainting our organization or tainting ourselves, because y'all got an absolutely lousy ass reputation of actually providing any services inside of a jail or outside of a jail. So I want to know, how do we control the BSCC, who puts on it to the most part law enforcement, to make decisions about money and our freedom? So like
like I said, I'm really sorry that a state legislator wasn't here who could talk about how do you enhance the authority and oversight over the BSCC, because I think that's who we need to be directing some of those questions to. Dorothy, did you have a question?
Yes, hi, I'm Jared with Project Retail in San Francisco. I have a question for the sheriff. I'm not sure if this question falls in your territory, but we're concerned about the San Francisco youth, and we've been following the story regarding the closing of the detention center, and we just want some clarity or any information that lets us know when would this closing take place, and what are the plans to relocate the youth once the facility is closed?
So that's not something that as sheriff I have any control over, because it's a juvenile probation runs the Juvenile Justice Center. And I think you may have read that Alan Nance just left today. He announced that he's leaving. He's the juvenile probation head. And the Board of Supervisors, I believe, said they want it closed by 2021, but there's no plan at this time that I'm aware of.
Thank you.
Sorry, I can't be more helpful.
Given the overcrowding of prisons, is there California reform being pushed for regarding bail, police accountability, and employment
I can't hear her.
Do you mind standing up and just because we can't hear down here?
Yeah. Given the overcrowding of prisons, is there California reform being pushed for regarding bail, police accountability, and employment opportunities for formerly incarcerated people?
I think I heard you talk about overcrowding in the prisons.
Basically, reform regarding bail, police accountability, and employment opportunities for formerly
Okay,
incarcerated
so bail I can speak to very well, because I was sued, and the federal government, and I chose not to fight it, because I agree that bail was not fair. It's just not fair the way it's done. But what happened was the federal court, and I worked on, had many hours and hours of mediation with the federal magistrate and the plaintiffs in the case, that said basically that the bail schedule, which is written by the Superior Court, which is promulgated by the Superior Court in each county, then in San Francisco that the sheriff should not agree to abide by the bail schedule and let people out. Now that's pre-arraignment. That's before they go to court. And so we just had a meeting today to fund more robust alternatives to incarceration in order to get rid of the bail schedule. It should happen probably in March, and we will be no longer using the bail schedule at all in San Francisco. And I would imagine that opens the door for that to happen in other counties. So we already have a robust pretrial release system, but this will make it 24/7. And the judges have agreed to review the cases more regularly, make it more quick, and help it proceed more efficiently and faster. A lot of pieces to it, but it's going to happen. So that's one thing that's happening. You also asked about employment. And in our county jail, we do have a lot of community-based organizations that come, and I have contracts with so many that come in and offer services to people and work with them. Now, once again, because we never know the length of stay for somebody, it's hard to plan, but we try to do we have social workers that come in and try to work with people with reentry plans. We have a men's mentoring group made up of people from the community that work with people, tried to provide mentors for people when they get outside. But employment is tough, and we do some vocational training where we can. We do safe serve certificates so people can work in food service. It's like the basic certificate. We're trying to do some more of that. We do college classes, we do high school classes. So, and then we try to connect and one of the most difficult things is connect people with services on the outside and coordinate that in a way that makes sense. And I think that that's a challenge still, and it's something that we need to do better at.
We're going to have time for one last question, and then hope maybe our panelists will be able to stay afterwards, and if you want to come up and ask additional questions.
Oh, hi. So for Sheriff Fennessy, small two-part question. So how exactly were the prison reform advocates able to stop the building of the new safer facility? Like, what exactly was the process?
Well, I think that well, first of all, I think they're a very smart group.
Okay.
and I think that they were very well organized. And they were able to come to meetings and press their advocacy in a very concerted way, and they had some very good spokespeople, and I'm friends with some of them, and they understand my side that I hate having to manage a jail that's really terrible, shouldn't be there. I also know that in San Francisco, I believe that we have done everything we can to release people safely who can be released, and then that's I think where we would probably differ in this panel a bit. And I also know that we've had independent studies done by experts that said, the elimination of mass incarceration, how San Francisco did it, and that's going back as far as 2014. So I also think that there's two groups of people that care about jails. The advocates care about the people in jails, and they're very passionate and emotional, and they want to, and it comes from the heart, and I think that that's a good thing. But I also think there's people that think they don't want to spend money on jails because they don't care, and they think that people should get what they deserve when they go to jail. So jails should not be nice places, or jails shouldn't be places that are conducive to fostering a learning environment or a treatment environment. And because it does cost more to make them that way. It costs more not to make jails, not to have them be dormitories. A dormitory is much cheaper than building individual rooms for people. But individual rooms keep people safer from each other and give them some privacy. So,
what's the current status of that grant that you got?
Well, that grant, we gave it back.
Oh,
Back in 2016, we turned it back in because we weren't going to meet the deadlines or the timelines because the Board of Supervisors would not approve the money. Because we have to have matching funds, actually more than matching funds.
oh, I
Yeah,
know.
yeah, it's not just, that money was not enough. It would have been about 260 million total.
So I just want to close by thanking you. I think you've brought up some really important issues tonight. And then maybe just ask you one final question that, that obviously you could speak to for hours, but maybe just if you could give a crisp answer to, has realignment worked?
Nice, easy one.
Yeah.
I'll start and just say that there are clearly things that realignment did that were objectively good, right? The whole origin of realignment was the state's dangerously overcrowded state prisons, unconstitutionally overcrowded state prisons. And what it did, very clearly, is it decreased the number of people in those state prisons. That's true. And so I think many people would say undeniably that is a thing that worked well. However, as our reporting shows, and we will continue exploring, there have been these unintended consequences in places that perhaps were not talked about early in this conversation about realignment. So I think yes and no.
I think it hasn't worked. I think it's working, because to say that it worked means that, let's all go home and, have a party. It is working and hasn't worked. We have a long ways to go. And I think that, like I said, this is probably the best time and era to really look at incarceration differently. And I think that the only real way to look at it is that to really step outside on looking at someone like, say, a criminal, or looking at a crime as just a crime. Because what we're basically doing is that we're not incarcerating criminals, we're incarcerating poverty and inequality. You know what I'm saying? If you go to, say, it's not nothing unique to like Raza or blacks. You go to East Side Europe, you go to Ireland, where they got historically, issues with inequality and poverty. You got crime there, you got gangs there. So why is it that? Why is that? Well, it's because of inequality and poverty. The same sort of thing we have here in California in some of our communities,
Thank you. Chair Hennessy?
I agree with both of them.
Okay,
So-
great.
Yes and no, yes, and it's continuing.
Right.
Yes.
Well, please join me in thanking our. Thank you so much.
Thank
Sharon, we do a lot of work together.
Yes, I know. So, I know.